You've probably heard a lot about trusts, and the most common phrase that you've heard is family trust or living trust, which is a revocable, amendable trust that you can change at any time, revoke at any time. But there are other types of trusts that we use depending upon what the scenario is that presents itself. And your living trust is basically going to be your foundation that you put in place to start your estate plan. And then as life gets more complex, we may build on that living trust with other types of trusts, such as if you start to really make a lot of money, your business just does phenomenally well, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a position where you exceed the federal estate tax exemption. If you and your wife, you're above the $25 million. Well, maybe now we want to start building a charitable remainder trust on that, to do something to avoid some of those estate taxes that you'd otherwise be paying to the government. So charitable trusts are something that we may want to put in place. Or if you have a business or significant commercial real estate holdings and you want to start to liquidate these things, capital gains taxes become a real issue. And maybe the charitable trust is a vehicle to avoid or reduce some of the capital gains tax liability. So again, there are other trusts out there over and above the living trust that as life changes and becomes more complex that we start to build on. I mentioned that life being what it is, planning for blended families is more common for me now than not. And when you plan for blended families, you want to use something called an AB trust. And people say, well, what do you mean? What is an AB trust? And an AB trust is simply, it's a living trust, but it splits into two trusts on the death of the first spouse. So let's say you get married for a second time and you both have children from a previous relationship. Well, you don't want to unintentionally disinherit your kids. So how do we plan for that? We use something called an AB trust. And so when the first spouse passes away with an AB trust, half of the assets go into the A trust and half of the assets go into the B trust. Well, how do you really manage that? How do you visualize it? And I tell my clients, well, the A trust is usually referred to as the survivor's trust, and the B trust is usually referred to as the decedent's trust. And I said the best way to think about that is A stands for above ground, B stands for below ground. And that's how you'll know who the A trust gets and who the B trust is. So if you're the decedent, your half assets go in the B trust, and the surviving spouse has half the assets in the A trust. And typically, men predecease their wives. So statistically, the wives are the beneficiaries in the A trust, and they'll use the assets in the A trust during their lifetime to support themselves. And if they deplete those assets, they can then invade the B trust to use those assets. But then what happens is at the death of the second spouse, well, the assets that the spouse owned, the surviving spouse, their separate property assets and community property assets go to their children. And whatever in the B trust and the separate property assets of that spouse and community property assets go to those heirs. So you haven't unintentionally disinherited anybody that way, and the money has still been managed during the joint lifetimes of those people. So, and again, there's irrevocable trusts that you can have set up for different reasons, and depending upon what happens, if you find yourself in a position where you're going to need long-term care and you own significant assets, you may want to set up what they refer to as certain Medi-Cal compliant trusts, which basically allow you to transfer assets out of your estate that can be managed for your children down the road and put you in a position where you can qualify for public benefits. So you can protect assets that way. For instance, and this, kind of hits a nerve with me. Under Medicare, if someone needs to have heart bypass surgery and they have to go into the hospital for bypass surgery, they may incur, $300,000 in heart surgeon bills and hospital bills, and it's covered under Medicare, 100%. That same person who's diagnosed with Alzheimer's or dementia has to go into an assisted living facility at $10,000 a month. Well, that's not covered. And statistically, especially males, they may last for maybe 3 years in a facility. And if you're okay, 3 years at $10,000 a month, that's like $300,000. On the one hand, the quadruple bypass patient, $350,000 covered by Medicare. On the other hand, Person with dementia goes into maybe for 3 years for $360,000, not covered. Where's the equity in that? So setting up, a Medi-Cal compliant trust to protect those assets for that family makes a lot of sense. So there are different trusts, depends on the circumstances as they arise, depending upon how we build it. You can set up trusts that are managed. For instance, when we do the children's trust inside of I advocate for most of my clients, if you're gonna leave money to your kids, let's put it into what I call a children's trust to asset protect it. And it basically gives them the ability to draw money out for certain purposes, education being one of them. And education, I like to include, vocational training, not necessarily, because people, education right away think, oh, it has to be college. No, I mean, if someone wants to learn, a trade, I think that's just as important. And it should be definitely spelled out that, you can use the money in the education trust to pay for vocational training as well. So again, there are a lot of different kinds of trusts. I mean, the basic, you got your basic living trust, which is the foundation that everything is built on. The other common trusts that people might encounter are, charitable trusts, irrevocable, Medi-Cal type trusts, educational trusts, things of that nature. Those are the basic kind of trusts that most people will encounter over and above, the AB trust that you'll use for a blended family. So again, if these kind of situations affect you and your family, and you want to make sure that your family is protected, there's a link at the bottom that you can come and talk to me to make sure that your family is protected.